Okay, Lynn, this question comes from the Stanford group. And they say, Mr. LaRouche, there is a deep divide that seems to have developed over how, in fact, we should deal with the question of re-regulation. Nouriel Roubini recently pointed out that while he agrees that Wall Streeters are greedy and often stupid, arrogant, and incompetent on top of it, that the fact is that we've had the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, and therefore the question that has to be asked is, are these Wall Streeters more greedy, more immoral, more arrogant, and more incompetent than they were 20 or 30 years ago? The fact is that I think the American people expect Wall Street to be greedy, but they also expect good policy making to control that behavior. It's been pointed out by Roubini and others that the job of the Federal Reserve is essentially to close the bar when the party really gets going. But the fact is that the Fed not only didn't close the bar, but they brought in a case of vodka. And Alan Greenspan seems to have been the biggest proponent of the kind of financial innovation that has gotten us into the mess we're in. Zero down payment mortgages, no verification of income, interest-only mortgages, negative amortization, all of this stuff. The fact is that the Fed did have the power to control it, but they chose not to because the prevailing ideology that seems to underlie the current crisis is that of Wild West, unregulated capitalists, and the idea that financial institutions will self-regulate. But it's clear that self-regulation means no regulation. Our question is, when we talk about re-regulating and when we talk about regulation, is it your view that this is the responsibility of the Fed, or that it has to be imposed by some other regulatory body, whether that be the FDIC, a completely new institution, whatever? Because certainly while the Glass-Steagall framework seems to function and seems to be something that should be applied, we are also familiar with some of the recommendations that have come out of former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, who seems to think that Glass-Steagall, while it's the right approach, would definitely require some serious updating to deal with the current geometry that we are functioning in.
Well, the answer is the following. The United States Constitution was made possible and necessary by the fact that the state banks, which had been state chartered originally, of the separate colonies, were now all virtually bankrupt because of the funding of the War of Independence. And at this point, Alexander Hamilton, who was to become the first Secretary of Treasury, came up with the proposal which resulted in the adoption of our federal Constitution. So you can say, in that sense, the federal Constitution is actually essentially Hamiltonian. Now, what he proposed was the concept of national banking. That is, that you have an intermediary agency, because of the nature of finance, between the federal government and its treasury and private banking and semi-private banking. You have an intermediary institution, which is a regulatory agency, which facilitates the integration of the function of government on the one side as a separate from this, and on the other side, the private banking aspect. And this is the American system. Now, you have to recognize a couple of things that are involved here in the line of the proposition, the question you posed, which affect this. First of all, you have to know that Andy Jackson was no damn good. And once you accept that, you're on the way to seeing things. What did Andy Jackson do? Andy Jackson was an agent of Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was a traitor and a British agent. And Andy Jackson worked for him. Now, what did Andy Jackson do as president? Andy Jackson was the vehicle for Wall Street and London interests in shutting down the Bank of the United States, the American banking system. And they brought in what was called the loan bank, the state loaning bank, which in 1837 resulted in what was called the Great Panic. So actually the United States was a victim of a target of a British operation, the same operation behind the slavery in the United States, which Van Buren, the later president, was part of for this thing, the land banks. And it broke the power of the United States to finance its own society. And it was done on behalf of the guy who owned Andy Jackson at the time, Martin Van Buren, who set up the land bank system and shut down the national banking in the United States, the second national bank. We now reached a point, so I don't think Andy Jackson is a good image for the Democratic Party, because the Cherokee might have something to say about it too. He was part of the process of getting them killed and sent into slavery. So the point is, what we need to get back to national banking. And what's that mean? At this point, the Federal Reserve System is implicitly bankrupt in respect of its functioning as a chartered organization under federal law. That means it automatically goes into receivership to the federal government. What do you do? Now, you have assets in there which are U.S. government assets. The U.S. government implicitly owns the Federal Reserve System. It is not an independent agency. It's bankrupt. We take into account all its obligations. So the federal government simply has to have one act. The Third National Bank of the United States. You put the Federal Reserve System not only into receivership, but in a form of receivership where the assets of the U.S. government, which own the Federal Reserve System, are now put in the custody of a national bank, using the precedent under which which inspired the adoption of the U.S. federal Constitution to deal with the problem of the local state chartered banks in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. Now you go to a national banking system under which the federal government uses a national bank as the interceding party between the federal government's functions and the general banking function with foreign banks and so forth and so on, as Hamilton laid it out. The thing's bankrupt. Put it into bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is not a bad idea, you know. Bankruptcy was set up to prevent slavery, debt slavery, and swindles. You put it into reorganization in bankruptcy. And the federal government, since the federal government is the chief creditor of the Federal Reserve System, we do two things. First of all, we end the Federal Reserve System's function of uttering notes in the name of the United States government. We go back to the utterance of currency by the Treasury. And credit by the federal government under an act of Congress. To create credit under our Constitution, you must get a bill through the House of Representatives and with the approval of the Senate and on the initiative and approval of the President to sign that bill. That's how you're supposed to print money. or other money in the name of the United States, not through some intermediary which takes over that job and adapts us to the international British system. You put the Federal Reserve System into receivership and use it as a part, as a subsidiary feature, its assets, as a subsidiary feature of national banking. Now we can take, instead of bailing out this thing and bailing out this thing, what we simply do, we use the power to create credit by the federal government and use that credit to assist bankrupt institutions in being put through bankruptcy reorganization. We don't bail out. We salvage. No more bailout. No more Federal Reserve helicopter money. No more bailout. We reserve the credit of the United States not to waste it as we're doing now on a great scale, but you now use the credit of the United States as a weapon of organizing investment to rebuild the economy. Huh? You know, right? Let's take the case of General Motors and so forth. Look what happened. In 2005, I was on two projects, which started at November 11th, 2004. And it was an adjunct of what I'd been doing in support of the Kerry campaign, for presidential campaign. So the Democratic Party was folding up. On November 11th, they were folding up. We had a meeting in Washington. And I proposed that we save the Social Security system. And this was picked up by some Democrats. And when the meeting was being held, you know, constituting the new Congress, this was put through. So we launched a fight to save the Social Security system when George W. Bush was about to destroy it, running around and doing kinds of crazy things, as he always did. So the second thing was a proposal to reorganize what had become the auto industry. You know? The same thing. Take the auto industry and strip it down to size. Strip it down, first of all, to what it was actually, where the automobiles that were actually needed, justified. Take the capacity. We had miles and miles of acreage of plants, which have been used since World War II for building airplanes and everything else you could think of. And that capability still existed in terms of floor space and in terms of the memory of the skills that went with the floor space. So, all right, separate this thing into two things. Reduce the auto industry to what the auto industry can do in making autos that are needed. Take the other part, especially the machine tool design part, and use that for what? We need, our river systems need to be repaired. We have all kinds of things. We need a national railway system again. We need these kinds of things. We need all kinds of things which are typical of the U.S. government's involvement in basic economic infrastructure. We have the machine tool design capacity of the United States is concentrated in the auto industry. You're going to shut it down, you idiot? No, you take it out and you put it under government protection as a new corporation, under government corporation. And you use it for these missions, all the things we need. You need highways, you need hospitals, you need river systems fixed, you need to take care of Katrina, the Katrina operation, all these kinds of things that came up that year. We can do it with the machine tool capacity of the auto industry. And the machine tool capacity of the auto industry, which represents floor space and represents people, also represents a labor force which is associated with the auto industry as its employment. So put them together. The same people working in the same communities can produce this for that area of the world right where they are. You don't need to move them around. You don't need to change anything. They report to the same place that they reported essentially. But now it's a government corporation. The auto industry is still there. It's operating separately. This thing is operating as a government agency for things we need, for public infrastructure, railway systems, magnetic levitation systems, port systems, hospitals, whatever we need, the way we did it under Roosevelt. And that's what we should do. So therefore, what we need is a national bank as the intermediary between the private sector of this kind of thing. So the national bank operates in that area where you have a public-private area, and you don't want to contaminate the public area with the private sector, and you don't want to contaminate the private sector with the public sector. But what the connection is, it is the Congress which enacts a law which authorizes this production, as in war production before, which is the mechanism. So what do? You set this thing in motion, and now you create all kinds of entities, projects and so forth, which are independently funded, and you have this public and private financing operation, which sets up these new kinds of things as the new industries to fill the vacuum. Yeah? So the federal government comes in with its money, sets something up under government protection. It's useful. These things lead then to private entities, which are spun off because they're now new industries. And so what you're really doing is you're spawning industries that we need for the future as an action of government. And when the government creates it, it may take a fatherly interest in the success of the thing, but you try to make it a private enterprise in most of these cases. The right thing to do. We don't need to do this hokey pokey that we're doing now. And the key thing is the Federal Reserve System is a corrupt institution, totally corrupted. Take it into receivership, make it clean, make it honest, make an honest woman of it. Marry it to something or other. And that's the solution. The case is sometimes we try to accept, somebody comes up to us and says, how can I do this? And sometimes that's the wrong thing to do. Step back a step. What is the need? What is the real purpose that should be adopted for this purpose? Then define what should happen, which may not be what somebody asks you to do, but it's the right thing to do. Does it do the job? Does it conform to the interests of the United States? If it does, do it. And I don't think we have any problem whatsoever in doing that job. We'll have a lot of problems in implementing it. But in principle, there's no problem in doing the job. We have to get people who are doing worthless things now. Look at our labor force. What section of the labor force is actually productive, that's so-called employed? Very little. We need to transform the labor force composition so we have people in producing useful things, physical things, scientific progress, all that sort of thing. We need to promote federal activity in this area. We need also to create spin-offs of new private industries which will fill the gap, and you have to get them started. So the government should be starting these things or helping them get started. And that's what we do. Keep it simple.